Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, a story that just captivated and then horrified Silicon Valley and beyond.
We're talking about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos.
Exactly. The rise and, well, the absolutely spectacular implosion of a company once valued at something like $9 billion, all built on a promise.
A promise of revolutionary blood testing, hailed as the next Steve Jobs, the black turtleneck, the whole persona. She had everyone convinced, politicians, big-name investors, even military brass.
It was an incredible narrative. A Stanford dropout set to democratize healthcare, miniaturize the lab, run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, but that's the narrative she sold.
Right.
Our mission today is to get behind that veil. We're using the source materials to really unpack how the fraud worked, the technical lies, yes, but also the culture inside Theranos, the fear, the sheer audacity of it all.
It's such a critical story because it really exposes the dangers when charisma and, let's be honest, massive fundraising completely overshadow the actual science and, crucially, the ethics.
Yeah, it was smoke and mirrors, right?
Yeah.
Protected by this intense secrecy.
An iron curtain, almost.
And you can trace so much of it back to Holmes herself, to her mindset, laser-focused, apparently, obsessively so.
Yes, and not just in a general driven founder way. There's this detail from the sources, something she kept physically on her desk.
Ah, the quote. Tell us about that.
Right. She apparently cut out a quote from a press article and had it right there. It was attributed to Channing Robertson, the Stanford professor who was, a key early supporter and on the board.
And what did the quote emphasize?
Well, that's the telling part. It was all about the importance of external validation, public support, keeping high-profile people believing in the vision.
So right there, front and center, the priority seems to be the appearance of success, the narrative, not necessarily, getting the science right first.
Exactly. It signals that maintaining the belief, the hype, the valuation, that was maybe goal number one. It wasn't necessarily about the painstaking, often frustrating reality of lab work.
That kind of focus, prioritizing the external perception over the internal reality, it must have shaped everything inside the company.
It absolutely sets the stage.
Yeah.
When the leader is rewarding the appearance of progress, the narrative, over actual verifiable results, you're basically creating fertile ground for ethical shortcuts. The goal shifts, right? It becomes about hitting that valuation target, pleasing investors, not necessarily about patient safety or scientific integrity.
Which brings us directly into the kind of environment they're fostered. This idea of a culture of, absolute authority and the resulting burnout.
Yes. If the main goal is protecting that image, that valuation, then anything or anyone standing in the way becomes disposable.
The sources really paint a chilling picture of that. The CEO's mindset seems almost ruthless when it came to her staff.
It wasn't a partnership, it seems. More like the employees were just components, interchangeable parts to serve the larger corporate machine.
There's that one really stark anecdote, isn't there? An argument between Holmes and an employee identified as Ed.
Yes, Ed was apparently running engineering teams, and he was pushing back hard. He was saying, look, you're demanding round-the-clock shifts. These people are burning out. It's unsustainable. He was raising a direct human concern.
A totally reasonable concern in any high-pressure environment. How did she respond?
According to the sources, her response was just incredibly blunt. No negotiation, no compromise. She apparently said flat out, I don't care. We can change people in and out.
Wow. I don't care. We can change people in and out. That's incredibly cold, especially for a healthcare company.
It gets worse, actually. She didn't just stop there. She reportedly followed it up with the justification, the core belief driving everything. The company is all that matters.
The company is all that matters. That explains so much. It's not the mission, not the patients, not the employees' well-being, just the entity itself, its survival, its valuation.
Precisely. And when that's the mantra, anything that threatens a company, like, say, admitting the technology doesn't work, becomes unthinkable. It becomes a betrayal that has to be hidden.
So dissent isn't just unwelcome, it's actively dangerous to the company's narrative. It has to be crushed.
And this mindset, it creates this almost willful blindness at the top, and obliviousness, really, to the practical realities, the human costs, the ethical corners being cut. If the company is the only sacred thing, then things like quality control, safety protocols, employee welfare, they all become secondary.
Or even obstacles.
Exactly. Obstacles to the primary goal. This absolute authority, this culture of fear, it's not just unpleasant, it's almost a prerequisite for the kind of systemic ethical failure we saw at Theranos. Because people learn very quickly that the only acceptable truth is the one that aligns with the leader's vision, regardless of what the data actually says.
You end up sacrificing reality for the sake of ambition.
And that relentless focus, that culture, it leads us right into the heart of the deception,
Mm.
the technical lie. The fact that the core technology, the very thing the whole $9 billion valuation was supposedly built on, it didn't work.
This is the bombshell, right? The foundation was rotten.
Completely. It wasn't just buddy or needing refinement. Internal sources, like this person identified as Allen, gave the unvarnished truth to the journalist investigating. The proprietary devices, the ones they called Edison's, quote, didn't work.
Didn't work how? Like occasionally glitchy or fundamentally flawed?
Fundamentally flawed. They were described as extremely error-prone, constantly failing quality control checks. The people inside, the engineers, the lab techs, they knew these machines weren't reliable. They knew they couldn't deliver what was being promised to the outside world.
So if the miracle Edison machines weren't working, how on earth were they processing all those patient blood tests? They were operating in Walgreens, right? Running thousands of tests.
Well, that's the next layer of the deception. The sources confirm they were only using the Edisons for a, quote, small number of tests, a tiny fraction of what they claimed.
So the vast majority of tests, where were they being run?
On standard, commercially available lab equipment. Machines made by Siemens, Beckman Coulter, basically their competitors.
Wait, they were secretly using conventional machines? The very technology they claimed to be disrupted.
Exactly, they had to. It was a complete shell game. They needed to maintain the illusion that their revolutionary Edison tech was doing all this comprehensive testing from just a few drops of blood. But the reality was they were relying on old-school Venus draw machines for most of it.
But Holmes's whole selling point was the tiny fingerstick sample. How could they run a tiny drop of blood on a big machine designed for a vial drawn from a vein?
They couldn't.
Yeah.
Not directly. And this is where the fraud becomes incredibly dangerous. This is the secret dilution scheme.
Okay, let's break this down carefully. This sounds like the real crux of the technical fraud and maybe the patient safety issue.
It absolutely is. So first, even if the Edisons had worked perfectly, they were primarily designed for a specific type of test called immunoassays. Think hormones, antibodies, certain proteins. But Theranos was out there marketing a huge menu, hundreds of different tests. Cholesterol, electrolytes, vitamin levels, blood counts. Way beyond what the Edison architecture, even in theory, could handle.
So they had this promise of a vast test menu, but the Edisons couldn't deliver it, so they turned to the standard lab machines.
Correct. The big conventional analyzers. But here's the problem. Those machines are built and calibrated to work with a standard test tube full of blood drawn from a vein, a relatively large volume.
And Theranos was collecting tiny pinprick samples, microsamples.
But exactly. Way too small for the conventional machines. So what do you do if you have a tiny sample but need to run it on a machine designed for a large one?
You have to make it bigger somehow.
You have to dilute it. They took that small fingerstick sample and added a buffer solution to increase the total volume, enough to fool the conventional machine into running the test.
Okay, diluting a sample. That sounds problematic. What does that actually do to the blood?
This is the critical, dangerous part. When you dilute that tiny blood sample so much, you drastically lower the concentration of everything in it. All the substances you're trying to measure, the analytes, like cholesterol, glucose, potassium, whatever it is.
So the stuff they're looking for gets spread really thin.
Extremely thin. Think about it like trying to measure the sugar in a single drop of lemonade. Easy enough. Now pour that single drop into a gallon jug of water and try to measure the sugar concentration in the jug.
It would be almost impossible to get an accurate reading. The concentration would be minuscule.
Precisely. The conventional machines, which are accurate for normal blood samples, simply couldn't reliably measure these superdiluted analytes. The levels fell below what the machines were designed to detect accurately.
So the results they were getting from these diluted samples, they wouldn't be accurate.
They were often wildly inaccurate, unreliable, medically meaningless in many cases. This wasn't just a technical shortcut. It was knowingly compromising the results to maintain the facade. It directly put patient health at risk.
This transforms it, doesn't it? From a financial lie about technology into something much darker. They weren't just faking the method, they were faking the results.
Yes, they were sending out potentially incorrect medical information to patients and doctors because the workaround required it. As one insider later testified, the results were about as reliable as flipping a coin. That dilution scheme was essential to keep the business running, but it turned the entire operation into a potential hazard.
And all this technical corner cutting, this pressure to maintain the illusion, it makes more sense when you realize the financial pressure they were likely under, even early on.
That's a really important layer. Technical desperation often goes hand in hand with financial desperation. The sources mention a complaint from an investor group, the Partner Fund, way back in February 2014. So not everyone was buying the hype even then.
Right, cracks were appearing.
And despite the multi-billion-dollar valuation headlines, later on, around February 2017, it came out they only had about $200 million in cash left at the end of the previous year. For a company supposedly scaling up nationwide with huge operational costs, it's not a lot of runway.
Especially when your core product doesn't actually work and you're spending fortunes on lawyers, which we'll get to.
Exactly. That ticking financial clock, combined with the fundamental technical failure, it creates this pressure cooker. And when you can't fix the tech and the money's tight, what's left?
Secrecy and intimidation. Protecting the lie becomes the only strategy.
Which leads us right into that next phase. Silencing anyone who might expose the truth. The legal warfare, the intimidation tactics.
Yeah, the company's response when the Wall Street Journal, specifically John Carreyrou, started digging, it wasn't just standard PR spin, was it?
Not at all. It was scorched earth. The source material details these really aggressive campaigns to smoke out internal sources to identify and punish whistleblowers. It went way beyond typical corporate damage control into something much more menacing.
The story of the source known as Erica is just chilling.
It really is. She received this threatening envelope. She believed she was being followed, mentioning seeing a specific man in an SUV near her home repeatedly, feeling surveilled.
That's terrifying. And then the legal hammer came down.
Directly. An ultimatum delivered via Theranos' lawyer, and they didn't hire just anyone. They brought in David Boies.
David Boies, a huge name in American law, known for incredibly aggressive, high-stakes litigation. Representing Harvey Weinstein, Al Gore in 2000, bringing him in sends a very specific, very intimidating message.
Absolutely. It signals that the company sees this as an existential threat and is willing to spend enormous amounts of money and deploy the most feared legal tactics available, not to solve the problem, but to crush the people revealing the problem.
It's a deliberate strategy. Use fear. Use the threat of ruinous legal costs to silence truth tellers who are usually former employees without those kinds of resources.
Imagine the psychological pressure. You get a letter from David Boies' firm. You think you're being watched. It's designed to make you fold, to make you terrified, to cooperate further.
The journalist actually had to advise Erica on how to handle it, right?
Yeah. Carreyrou apparently told her, look, treat the letter as a bluff. They probably don't have concrete proof you're a source. Acknowledge the surveillance mentally, but try to go about your business. The fact that this kind of cloak and dagger advice was necessary tells you everything about the atmosphere Theranos created.
And what was the core truth they were so desperate to protect with these tactics? The unreliability of the tests.
That's what it all came down to. You mentioned the coin flip analogy earlier that came from Tyler Schultz, another whistleblower, grandson of board member George Schultz. In a deposition in March 2017, he said testing at Theranos was as if you flipped a coin enough times.
You just can't have that in a clinical lab. It undermines the entire purpose.
It's the ultimate failure. And the source There's documentation showing that as late as March 2016, the company couldn't even refute the allegation that the lab had kept running patient tests despite knowing about serious, ongoing quality control failures.
So they knew the system was broken, knew the results were questionable, but kept testing patients anyway, and then used extreme measures to silence anyone who said so.
That's the pattern. Deny the science, suppress the evidence, intimidate the witnesses. But even David Boies couldn't hold back the tide forever. The internal leaks in the journalism were crucial, but ultimately it was the formal regulatory process that brought the house down.
Right. The government inspectors finally got inside. Which brings us to the regulatory hammer finally falling.
Exactly. All the legal maneuvering, it bought time, maybe, but it couldn't stop the inevitable scrutiny from the agency actually responsible for lab safety, CMS.
The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. These aren't investors swayed by charisma. These are federal regulators looking at protocols and data.
And people inside Theranos knew the CMS inspection was bad news. Sources say employees were telling former colleagues in late 2015, early 2016 that the inspection had, quote, not gone well. Understatement of the year, probably.
Because when the official CMS findings came out about the Newark, California lab, They were devastating.
Devastating is the right word. They didn't just find procedural errors, they found serious deficiencies,
Yeah.
widespread fundamental problems.
And then came the phrase that really sealed Theranos' fate.
Yes. The CMS inspectors concluded that the problems they found posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety.
Let's just pause on that. Immediate jeopardy. That's not bureaucratic hedging. That's the federal government saying your lab operations right now are actively dangerous to the public.
It's the regulatory equivalent of a five-alarm fire. It means the failures are so profound and systemic that patient lives are potentially at risk with every test result that goes out the door. It was complete validation for the whistleblowers and the journalists.
It shifted the narrative irrevocably. This wasn't just a struggling startup or even financial fraud anymore. It was officially declared a public health risk.
And that finding came with a ticking clock. CMS gave Theranos just 10 days. 10 days to submit a credible plan to fix everything. The alternative. Losing their federal lab certification, which would effectively shut down their entire testing operation.
Faced with this existential crisis, this official condemnation, surely now they'd focus on fixing the lab, right?
You would think.
Yeah.
But even then, their final moves were still about controlling the story, not fixing the substance.
Still focused on the narrative.
Unbelievably, yes. The sources show that Heather King, one of Theranos' lawyers, was busy sending letters to CMS in March and early April 2016. And what was she asking for?
Let me guess. Trying to delay.
Worse. She was, quote, demanding that the agency make redactions to the inspection report before it was released to the press.
They were trying to censor the government's findings, to hide the immediate jeopardy part from the public.
That seems to be exactly it. They knew how damaging that phrase would be. Their instinct, even at the brink of collapse, was to manage the PR, to spin the disaster, rather than fundamentally address the cause of the disaster.
It just underscores the whole theme, doesn't it? Appearance over reality, narrative over proof, right until the very end.
It reveals the core dysfunction. A company so invested in its own myth that it couldn't pivot to truth, even when facing regulatory annihilation and clear evidence of patient harm. The vision had become more important than the reality it was supposed to serve.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this. We've covered the culture, the tech failure, the intimidation, the regulatory collapse. Looking back at the whole story arc through these sources, what are the main takeaways, the lessons of this massive lie?
I think you can boil it down to a few core truths that emerge undeniably from the sources. First, the technology was a sham, the Edison didn't work, and the workaround, that dilution scheme, was scientifically unsound and dangerous. That's pillar one. Technical fraud.
Got it. Pillar two.
Pillar two is the culture. An autocratic, fear-based environment built entirely around that mantra. The company is all that matters. It demanded loyalty to the narrative above loyalty to scientific fact or patient well-being, and ruthlessly punished dissent.
Okay, technical fraud, toxic culture, and the third.
The third is how it unraveled. While the internal leaks in the journalism were absolutely vital in exposing it, the final nail in the coffin was the external regulatory power. CMS stepping in and issuing that immediate jeopardy finding. It took the force of government oversight to finally pierce the shield of lies and legal threats.
So fraud, fear, and finally, inescapable regulatory facts.
Exactly. And the broader lesson here, especially for Silicon Valley and maybe beyond, is about that fake it till you make it ethos. Theranos is the ultimate cautionary tale of pushing that idea into the realm of healthcare, where the stakes are literally life and death.
When you're dealing with medical diagnostics, faking it isn't just misleading investors, it's potentially harming patients.
Precisely. The compelling vision, the charismatic founder, none of it matters if the product doesn't work, or worse, if it gives dangerously wrong information. The Theranos story shows how quickly that gap between hype and reality can become a massive ethical and public health disaster. The immediate jeopardy finding wasn't abstract. It was a direct consequence of prioritizing the lie over the science.
It really forces a reevaluation of how we view disruption and innovation, especially in sensitive fields like medicine. Charisma and a good pitch aren't substitutes for rigorous validation and safety.
Absolutely. Physics, chemistry, biology, federal regulations, they don't really care about your fundraising totals or your media profile. Reality eventually catches up.
So the final question that lingers, for me at least, and maybe for you listening, how did this go on for so long? With so many smart people involved, investors, board members, partners like Walgreens, how did the deception hold?
And that's the really provocative thought to leave with, isn't it? What allowed it? The sources suggest it was that internal dynamic that Fortress Holmes built. The absolute focus on growth, on valuation, on her own narrative that company is all that matters, idea created this bubble that deflected inconvenient truths.
It insulated her from reality.
It seems so.
Hmm.
It makes you question the whole ecosystem, an ecosystem that sometimes seems to value the story, the potential unicorn status, maybe more than the mundane, difficult work of actually proving something works reliably and safely. How much does that relentless focus on hype and ego enable founders to ignore practical and ethical boundaries right up until the regulators have to step in?
A chilling question and a vital one. This has been a truly illuminating, if disturbing, deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through these sources.
It was important to unpack. My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.